why studying welfare gains from free labor mobility is important. First one is empirical. Because of the shrinking working age population, by the year 2050, it has been estimated that OECD countries will require 400 million more workers to maintain pension system. The second reason is the contradiction between theory and practice. For more than 30 years, economic literature documents huge welfare gains from cooperation and labor mobility. Estimates vary from 1% to 300% based on the way a scientist measures the cost of migration. For example, Frédéric Bocquier studies removal of legal migration costs only, while, for example, Klaus Desmet considers removal of all migration costs, including information and psychological costs. Additionally, many studies consider joint welfare gains, abstracting from the political feasibility. Anyway, even though migration policy is reasonably one of the largest distortions in economics, in practice, it's still highly regulated. Most developed countries follow restrictive policies, and 80% of the world population cannot work in any foreign country without a permit. If there are large benefits of free labor mobility, why so few countries enjoy them? Is it the structure of economies or political demands, or is it something else? So I propose a model that answers these questions. Basically, although benefits are large, their feasibility is limited by three main factors: agglomeration, politics, and strategic interaction. Agglomeration differently affects productivity, and as a consequence, optimal sizes of countries persist to differ. Then under excessive supply of labor, it is difficult to find economies that would mutually benefit from labor mobility. Political demands represent a socially acceptable weighting of individual interests based on their characteristics, and this weighting is crucial when determining optimal policy and benefits. The interaction between countries here is modeled as a Nash game, and in some cases, it leads to inefficient policy choices that, however, can be improved by establishing an international migration union, where this union is just a combination of countries committed to a free labor mobility policy between them. And so I have a few results here that migration union as a form of commitment is most efficient between similar countries with low agglomeration. And the second result is that migration union leads to more labor mobility outside of the union. And now I will try to explain how a dynamic gravity setting features all these mechanics. So the model originates from works of Arduk and McLaurin on labor mobility in a dynamic setting and incorporates many features from works of trade economists like Caliendo, Dworkin, or Barrow. So it has N countries indexed by I and J. It has N nationalities indexed by N, S skill types, low skilled and high skilled, and T denotes the time period. So each country is characterized by an initial mass of households by nationality, an infinite number of firms, an endowment of immobile capital, some country-specific parameters, and distances and migration costs. So these two, the last two, will create frictions for goods and labor mobility. And there are three types of agents in the model. So there are households that decide how much to consume and where to work, and there are firms who decide how much to produce and where to sell. And also there are governments. They collect tariffs and tax revenues and produce public goods. However, in addition to that, each government will simultaneously decide on the optimal migration policy. And it will be the main novelty of the model that will allow us to study migration unions. So households residing in country I has a Cobb-Douglas utility consisting of public goods and private goods that they can buy using their wage after tax. Private goods have infinitely many varieties denoted by omega, with constant elasticity of substitution between them. So However, migrants' behavior is not only income driven. So for example, there are people moving from the United States to Mexico. Why do they move? They move because there is a part of preferences which is not observed by a researcher. It might include location preferences, job preferences, cultural preferences, or exogenous factors like policies. And to account for that, I assume that besides income, a household has an idiosyncratic preference of the location, which is epsilon here. It aggregates everything that cannot be explained by income variation and follows a Gumbel distribution with variance mu. So then a household lifetime utility is just the sum of instant utility and the value of so-called option to move. So it makes it possible for migrants to downgrade in income in order to get a larger payoff in terms of option to move. And so every time a household moves, it pays a migration cost. So I disaggregate them in two parts, an endogenous time varying part and part that is fixed over time. When you solve modeling time differences, the fixed part disappears and you work only with this endogenous part in changes. And so this part I will be calling migration policy costs. They will be endogenously chosen by country of destination. Now, to eliminate stochastic nature of these unobserved preferences, we can take expectation over the lifetime utility with respect to epsilon. The resulting deterministic value function basically represents the behavior of a representative household. And then further using these assumptions on the Gumbel distribution, I can derive this mu here, which is a share of people moving from country I to country J at time t of a particular nationality and skill type. Okay, and so large migration shares correspond to large gross migration flows between countries. So it can be shown under symmetric production policies that these migration shares in steady state will be equal across locations. Okay, and it's also easy to see here that when migration costs M become larger, we'll see that these migration shares and gross migration flows become less and less. Okay. So given these migration shares, the labor dynamics is modeled as a sum of all incoming migrants, including those people who decided to stay in the same country. Okay, so within a country, there are a lot of firms producing different goods. Each of the firms employs CES production function with high-skilled and low-skilled labor. Also the immobile capital H, and random productivity zeta. So this random productivity depends, follows a Fréchet distribution and depends on the level of technologies T that depends on a country-specific component that doesn't change in time, and the component that depends on the density, on the labor density. And zeta here is the agglomeration force. So large zeta would imply increasing returns to scale, while low zeta decreasing returns. So firms with larger productivity can produce the same amount of goods using less factors. So, and as a consequence, in countries with productive firms, labor can enjoy higher consumption. Immobile capital H, you can think about it as about infrastructures. So, however, the ownership of this capital and corresponding returns does not belong entirely to natives. The ownership is separated among all countries based on trade imbalances, and in this way it models international flow of capital returns. So therefore, basically, if labor supply decreases in a country, firms substitute labor with these immobile structures, and it benefits structure owners that are mostly developed countries. If you solve profit maximization problem, you'll end up with the equation that tells you how marginal costs acts depends on wage and different elasticities, and also the the skill premium equation. And then following the paper of Eaton and Corton on random productivity, I can derive the gravity equation of trade, which shows what share of consumption is imported and exported. And K here stands for iceberg transportation costs and trade tariffs. So because of these frictions, countries trade less with distant countries and more with border countries. It can also be seen that, for example, countries with cheap labor and low marginal costs export more than countries with expensive labor. And price index here is just a weighted sum of domestic prices, and those weights are basically the transportation costs. Okay, so production function, generally speaking, is a way to express wages as a function of labor, and after all, to express utility as a function of labor. Okay, but to do so, we'll need some market clearing conditions. So since household consumes public goods, I assume that they are funded via trade revenues and tax revenues. I shall also claim that the total value of goods produced or consumed X here should equal to the sum of the value of these public goods plus labor income and returns to immobile capital. So, and then because the production function is also Cobb-Douglas, a share gamma of the value added goes to capital owners, and 1 minus gamma goes to labor workers. Basically using this set of equations, we can determine how labor movement affects wages and utilities. But for clarity, I will show you that in special cases of the model with homogeneous labor and just two symmetric countries, it's much easier to see what happens. Okay, so to simplify this equation, I also additionally assume that there are no transportation costs. Okay, so the immediate implication of that is that price indices will be equal across countries, and instead of real wages, we can just work with nominal wages. So having normalized the wage of the second country to 1, it's explicit that here, for example, wage is decreasing in labor as long as it's raised to a positive power. Okay. Additionally, it can be shown that a relative increase in technologies eta, for example here, or immobile capital H, leads to increase in wage gap and as a consequence in motives for migration. So utility is different from wage because instead of nominal wage, it depends on real wage and has also a part that comes from public goods consumption. So apparently, the shape of utility will crucially depend on the combination of parameters that can be divided into two groups: agglomeration forces and congestion forces. So agglomeration forces, like density-driven technologies or public goods, make utility increasing in labor, while congestion forces like trade elasticity or share of immobile capital decreasing in labor.
Sorry,
yes?
Nikita, there is a question by the audience. I will read it. Am I reading your production function right, that you assume immigrants are perfectly substitutable with natives within skill bins? Is
yes.
that reasonable or just an assumption made for tractability?
Okay, so yes, it's correct. They are perfect substitutes here. I know that there are many papers that tell that they are not. Yeah, so basically it's for sake of simplicity. The model is already has a lot of mechanics inside. But definitely thanks for that comment. Maybe I'll find a way how to introduce that in the model just by plugging some nested structures on the production function. yeah, but even like that, it's quite hard to understand what's happening inside.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Sorry, Nikita, I would actually ask you a question before you also move on, since you have just explained the production. I was wondering whether it would be possible, if not an overcomplication of the model, to let the firm productivity be heterogeneous within the country. Is that something that is feasible?
Yeah, yeah. So that's what I'm working with. So that is why okay, so yes, heterogeneous productivity that might come from the distribution here of the productivity itself, and basically it is already heterogeneous because we have I calibrate this ADA, which is country specific, and there's also a dynamic component which is also country specific. What is not heterogeneous here is this agglomeration effect zeta, and this is where probably I'll do the next extension of this paper. But yes, so it's already heterogeneous and can be extended.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So on the left-hand side here, you can see the utility as a function of labor for 3 different levels of density-driven technologies. And when agglomeration is large, the maximum of the utility is obtained when everybody's at one country on the right-hand side. When agglomeration is low, none of labor is welcomed, and especially immigrants. On the right-hand side, you can see lines at which the derivative of utility with respect to labor equals 0 for different levels of public goods consumption. So first of all, you can see that when the share of public goods consumption grows, so we go from yellow line to blue line, the derivative is positive even for very low agglomeration here. And the second point, you can see that for some points here, there may be multiple stable solutions based on the initial endowment of labor, like the B prime and C prime. Okay, so to sum up, the amount of labor maximizing utility depends on the set of agglomeration and congestion forces, and so does the optimal level of immigration. The only difference between immigrants and natives is that natives can be affected only through labor market, while immigrants also through a migration policy. And so here we come to the role of the government. So each government chooses migration policy costs M to maximize weighted welfare of natives, okay? And so these weights, lambdas here, represent governmental attitudes towards, for example, skill and residence. So the government differently values their natives based on which skill they have and where they reside. And these weights follow just a simple majority rule for now. So then the value function here can also be rewritten using migration share of natives deciding not to move anywhere. And it will be still the sum of instant utility and this value of an option to move, okay? So while we know how utility changes with labor movement, less is known about this option. So to get an intuition, we should try to maximize value function with respect to migration costs. So let's just denote any variable with prime to be a derivative with respect to migration policy costs here, okay? Then you can see that the change in the value function depends on changes in utilities weighted by the probability of arriving at a particular destination at a particular point in time, given that households begin their path at home, okay? And so there are 2 things to notice. First is that these probability weights come from the idiosyncratic preference. So they depend on migration policy and they will determine the optimal policy. The second thing to notice is this M prime term here. So basically it is the response of one country to changes in immigration policy of a counterpart. And there is empirical evidence that these policy spillovers exist, and finding Nash equilibrium would capture these effects. So for clarity, I again simplify the model and I build best response functions for different levels of agglomeration. So you can see here the optimal response of one country and fixed policy of another country. So it's response to a fixed policy. So there are some things also to notice. So first is that when agglomeration is high, regardless of your counterpart policy, you tend to open borders, okay? But as agglomeration becomes less and less, you tend to respond with a closure of these borders, okay? And the second thing is that policies, they change their behavior from being strategic complements to strategic substitutes as agglomeration falls. So you can see, for example, here below, when the counterpart increases migration costs, the optimal response is also to slightly increase them. But when we deal with low agglomeration, it's vice versa. Okay, so we'll try to explain that. So the reason why strategic behavior changes is that curvature of utility function changes with agglomeration. If agglomeration is low, an inflow of immigrants, so it's the case A, the inflow of immigrants affects utility more than the option to move. And then the optimal response is to decrease probability weight in here assigned to utility, right? By a slightly smaller migration costs, okay? And vice versa in case of high agglomeration. So now my goal is to find Nash equilibrium, not just best response. So Nash equilibrium is a set of policy rules that no country would deviate from. And to reach this state using numerical methods, I allow countries to optimize their policies sequentially, given that at first, all other players' decisions are held fixed, okay? And then I update these optimal decisions and initialize optimization again. And I do it until all players converge to a fixed point. And if you look here on the graph, you'll see that policies, they remain quite stable already at the 10th or 14th iteration of the system. So now take a look first how Nash equilibrium on the left is different from the best response function on the right. So one observation on the left here is that the window of agglomeration that allows, so the color is the agglomeration. So this window of these parameters that allows countries to have immigrants is quite narrow. Okay, so just maybe between 2.5 and 2.55 here. And we jump from a complete openness to a complete closure. Now, if, for example, I establish a migration union between countries, so in other words, I will exogenously lower their bilateral migration costs to zero, they will no longer optimize against each other, but only against the third country. Okay, so first country and second country are in the union here, and they together kind of optimize against the third country. You can see that while third country here kind of closes a little bit more, the union members open their borders. So why union members open borders to outside countries? So after the union establishment, people that used to migrate to third countries now prefer going to member states. First, it creates excessive competition on these labor markets. And second, it decreases the value of an option to move, since one of the outside options, the third country, is now closed. And as a consequence, member states create incentives for some natives to return back and work in third countries by simply opening borders and inviting a few immigrants. So it changes natives' income and their option to move in such a way that the overall value function is maximized. Right. So since I model non-cooperative Nash game, the Nash equilibrium policy is not rather efficient. And therefore, union establishment may positively affect countries. So the first benefit comes from open borders, and so from the increased value of an option to move. The second benefit is an improvement in labor allocation, which, however, is very specific to profiles of member states. Okay. And to analyze those benefits, we can consider three cases. First one, for example, we have two symmetric high agglomeration countries. In the Nash equilibrium, both of them would completely open their borders. And then there are no gains from the union because there's no difference between Nash outcome and the union outcome. In the second case, when one of two countries has a high agglomeration, the country with a high agglomeration in the Nash will have lower costs. And then their removal will lead to inflow into low agglomeration country and outflow from a high agglomeration country. It's just lose-lose for both of countries in terms of utility. Nevertheless, they still gain in this value of an option to move. And third case is about two symmetric low agglomeration countries. They are both closed in the Nash equilibrium, but as soon as we impose a union, they open borders and gain from the option to move. The only difference is that because they are symmetric, they do not lose in terms of utility. Okay. So summing up, migration union, again, as a form of commitment, is most efficient between similar countries with low agglomeration. Okay, in the next part of the presentation, I will quantify these welfare gains from free labor mobility using data in 9 OECD countries. Some of these countries are in the migration union with each other. For example, Portugal, Sweden, United Kingdom, in year 2000, were a part of European Union, and Australia and New Zealand, for example, also were a part of free labor mobility agreements. And so I want to estimate baseline economy and compare welfare of these nations under counterfactual free labor mobility agreements. So I'll simply simulate different migration unions and present welfare gains here in the following table. So this table tells you that, for example, a scenario in which Israel joins the European Union leads to a 0.3% increase in welfare for Israelis and 0.8% increase for European citizens at almost zero cost for the rest of the world, while high-skilled labor appears to be the most vulnerable group here. All scenarios are grouped into politically viable unions, economically efficient unions, and those that didn't prove to be viable at all. So politically viable unions are those unions where each of the parties have positive welfare gains from establishment of the union. So they would both agree to go into this union. And economically efficient unions are those that have welfare gains positive only on aggregate, but separately they would not vote to join the union. Okay, so every point
Nikita,
here in this,
sorry,
yes?
if I may interrupt you,
Yeah.
on the table when you show this, so that the previous when you show these values, this is measured at the country level. So it's basically, so who's an Israeli in the first line? It's the population in Israel. You don't account for the move. I mean, I guess my question is how are the immigrants themselves accounted here? Do they appear somewhere?
Mm-hmm. They do not appear here directly. So we account only for the national welfare. So only natives are counted in. Nevertheless, in here, even if native lives abroad, say in any foreign country, he will still be accounted, but with a lower weight. And this is exactly the idea of these political preferences, that we have a majority of people living in our home countries, and so it would be logically to assume that countries would care about them, more than about those people who live abroad. But still, they care about them because they place embassies there. They provide some services for us, etc., etc.
So these weights would mirror the weights in the function to decide about the optimal policy.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay, I see. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so here, every point on this graph corresponds to a particular counterfactual scenario, okay, against some parameter of the economy. So, for example, top square in each of the figures, it's exactly the scenario when Israel joins European Union. Now, welfare gains here grow with the average share of public goods provision between partners. It's linked to the fact that public goods are a major agglomeration force, and that marginal costs of public goods production decreases with labor faster than the private goods production. And as a result, immigrants coming from, say, capitalistic economies to socialistic ones can instantly gain in public goods consumption. And the second figure also proves that point, that basically it's beneficial to establish cooperation when countries have opposite types of dominant ownership in the economy, though the absolute level also matters. The labor scarcity index here is high when partners have scarce opposite types of labor. So some country has scarce low-skilled labor and another one high-skilled labor. And so the graph shows that bilateral labor exchange is also beneficial for cooperation. Then the trade is usually referred to as a substitute to migration. My result here shows that there's a small evidence that trade might be a complement to migration, but only when the intensity of trade is very high, closer to the right-hand side. Now, taxes are very similar to public goods in a way. So, and it also can be shown that for example, the tax rate that maximizes utility should be equal to the share of public goods provision. Okay. Now, proximity and distance in technologies and governmental preferences, those all are beneficial for partners. So, for example, here, in neighboring countries, distance is small, and migration costs, being the only way to prevent labor inflow, are higher than in distant countries. And as a result of liberalization, close countries experience a larger positive shock and gain more. For example, countries that are close in the level of technologies, so they're closer to the center of the graph, gain on average more because they gain in the value of an option to move, but do not lose much in terms of utility. So technology determines in many senses how similar will the production function be. And finally, I compare efficiency and political viability of unions given different measures of welfare and weighting rule. And here we will need to remember that our welfare objectives was weighted by some lambdas, these weights. Okay, so in the first row here, you see that the well-being is measured in terms of welfare, and in the second row in terms of consumption. Consumption is different from welfare here in that it does not include the value of an option to move. And you can see that the number of politically viable and economically efficient unions here is much larger when accounted for the value of an option to move. Okay. Then if you look into columns, the first column, there's a government that decides on welfare, on establishment of the union. And in the second column, there's natives that vote for themselves. So when government votes for the union, weights in the welfare objective follow just a simple majority rule. But when natives vote, weights are equal, they are egalitarian. So it can be just re-engineered back in the model. And you can see that the number of politically viable, again, and economically efficient unions, both of them, is much larger when people vote for themselves, when natives vote. So to conclude, I will just quickly go through the main points that I think important here. So migration union, again, is a form of commitment, is efficient for similar low agglomeration countries. However, they are completely useless if all countries have high agglomeration forces, including technologies and public goods. Migration unions lead to more labor mobility even outside of the union. And then we also found that the most favorable partners are contingent, intensely trading countries, having scarce opposite types of labor and high quality social security policies and technologies. Then the policy part tells us that if we allow people to vote for their freedom, and if this freedom, this value of an option to move, will have more value, the number of politically viable unions will increase. And finally, we managed to quantify welfare effects from establishing multiple counterfactual migration unions that might be, I hope, maybe of help for policy-making authorities. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Nikita. This was an extremely interesting presentation, and you're perfectly on time. So thanks for that. That leaves plenty of time for discussion. We now encourage panelists and attendees, in case you have a question, to just raise your virtual hand and then we will give you the floor. We already have one unanswered question by Brett McCulley. Brett, would you just like to unmute yourself and ask your question in person?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering if you've estimated the gains of establishing a union between a developing and a developed country like the U.S. and Mexico. I mean, I understand that maybe that wouldn't reach the level of political feasibility, but when we think of the gains from migration, that's where the biggest global gains from migration would accrue to. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah, you're right. So thank you for the question. In this version of the paper, there's no such estimate. So I took OECD countries. I know that US and Mexico, so I use OECD countries, but maybe in the next extension of this paper, I'll have those results. I'm working on that now. Yeah, but you can see at least maybe some other pairs of countries that are there. I'll just put the slide here because I wouldn't say which countries are more developed or less developed here. It will be impolite.
Okay, thank you very much. While we're waiting for our questions, I actually have a question regarding the results you find with distance. So here you implied geographic distance.
Okay. So the question, yeah.
No, I suppose that was, I guess, just a clarification. It's geographic distance.
Two types of distances. One is the geographic distance, yeah, and sometimes it's called iceberg cost. And the second version of the distance is the trade tariffs that kind of go above the geographic distance.
Okay, I understand. I was just wondering about other, how do you say, other costs that can form the overall migration cost, except sort of the direct migration cost that comes from distance. So I'm thinking cultural costs or linguistic costs. Have you tried anything along these lines, like looking also at linguistic distance or cultural distance?
I see. So in this paper, migration costs I'll say they aggregate everything that is not fixed over time. So if you have those cultural preferences that are not fixed over time, they would be already included there. So I assume that those migration costs that do not vary over time, they cannot be changed by government. Okay, so there are some really big cultural differences that persist over time. There are big technology differences that persist over time, etc., etc. But for the rest, it should be included already in the results.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. That makes sense. That makes sense because there is some evidence. For example, on a literature on social and political remittances. You know, migrants and return migrants that in turn shape the political landscape. You know, once they return back home. So I was just, but yeah, no, that makes.
Yeah. Thank you for that comment.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
So I actually have a bunch of questions myself, and I encourage in the meantime participants to also submit their own. So you said that you wanted to expand the sample of countries, and I guess that is a major thing to assess the robustness of this counterfactual analysis that you do.
Exactly.
And I guess it must be also a pretty hard endeavor to actually collect this data. So my question is, how many countries do you expect to reach at some point? And then another question that relates to this data retrieval on the other side. So I saw that in the budget constraints of the households, you have wages. But I was wondering, and this goes against the ease of retrieving data. But I was wondering whether it would be feasible to retrieve also data, because I'm thinking maybe household wealth could have an impact into the way households face those migration costs. So I'm wondering whether, I guess it's not a theoretical problem. You could have included it in the theoretical model. So I'm just wondering whether that would be feasible in terms of data.
Thank you. So in terms of countries, there's a win. If you increase number of countries, you increase robustness of your results. But on the other hand, if you have a lot of countries, this model is very computationally expensive, and this dimensionality might just eat a lot of time. But I would expect that between 20 and 30 countries that would be possible to do. The data on that, it is very hard. Probably you know that it's very hard to find data on gross bilateral flows divided by nationality and skill. So some of this data maybe will be inferred using some pseudo-Bayesian approaches using data on stocks, and we'll see. The wealth, that's actually a good point. I'm thinking about it quite a lot, because savings of people kind of influence decisions on migration very much, and that would be nice to have the wealth accumulation process on the top of that. I also found a few papers. Maybe one is written by Caliendo and his colleagues, where he has the dynamic capital equation. So probably that would be an extension later on after I extend the number of countries. For the rest, data is basically, for OECD countries, data is acceptable on the OECD databases there.
Okay, great. Thanks for your answer.
Thanks for questioning.
We have more questions in the audience. I just want to leave the floor to the audience. Otherwise, I have one more question, rather out of curiosity, really, which is if you have somehow also considered looking into FDI for indirect investment? You know, since you know.
Yeah, not yet. Yeah, it's on my list. Not yet.
Okay, because that would be really interesting, I think, also to
absolutely.
see, like,
But exactly, as soon as for example, I manage to introduce this wealth accumulation, then there will be probably a possibility to store the wealth in different countries, and that would be in some way can be calibrated using data on FDIs. But that's only my idea is not developed so far.
Yeah, really cool. Really excited to see where this is headed to. Yeah.
If I may jump in on that point, I'm wondering how far FDI and also the household wealth accumulation is compatible with the way you are modeling. I mean, with the way capital plays a role in your model at the moment. So you have this fixed age.
Yeah, for now it's a mobile capital age, so it's just infrastructures. It's not exactly the capital.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's one paper, so as I told by Caliendo, something about mobile firms, I think, recently published. So he has a capital accumulation process, and it's not infrastructures. It's exactly the capital. Yeah, only then might be possible, I guess, to do something.
Yeah. Okay. I was just. This is maybe more of a comment. I mean, this role of age is still a bit puzzling to me. Like in particular, how the returns of the capital are distributed, and also the role that this has in the whole model. So I think extending it towards either of the directions that were just mentioned would not be my first, let's say, my first priority in terms of understanding the model better, because it's so rich in, and we have had this discussion in the past. It's so rich in terms of mechanisms that it's I think it's more important to first really understand how far each of the things ongoing now, for example, the role of age of the capital as it stands in the whole process, in the whole counterfactual simulations is, before going to the two directions that you were just discussing, because those I think will even complicate the model more. And I mean, basically having FDI would have the only missing link, because you have mobile or potentially restrictive mobile workers, you have mobile goods to trade, and so having capital would, I mean, obviously would be interesting, but it's I think it's going to be very difficult to pin down what's driving the different results once.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there has to be a reason for inclusion of FDIs in the model. So if for example I finish this paper and we'll pose a separate question about how some, I don't know, FDIs influence welfare gains, or FDIs influence whatever dynamics, then maybe it's very reasonable to do so. Yeah. In terms of FDIs also, maybe Alexei, maybe you could read something about GTAP models. These are not exactly this kind of modeling that I do. These are more kind of empirical models with a lot of data, with a lot of input-output tables. But maybe it will be interesting for you just to read something about it. I'll write you an email later on, okay?
Absolutely, thank you. So, all right, I think we're coming towards the end of today's session. Thank you again very much for the super cool presentation, and for everybody for the discussion afterwards. And I will now give the floor to my colleague Giuseppe to conclude.
Thank you.
All right, so thanks Nikita for this presentation, and I will share my screen with the next week's speaker. So next week we're going to have Matteo Gamalerio from IEB Uni Barcelona, who's going to present a paper on the political economy of open borders, theory and evidence on the role of electoral rules. So as you can see, there is also a continuum of themes So as to the schedule, you can see it on our website. We have the junior and the senior components. We have our own schedule, and you can also keep sending us your manuscripts. We will review them on a rolling basis. And as you know, we now have this new panelist feature whereby some people can sign up to be panelists of the session. So that is it. I think we are on time. So I want to wish all the best to Nikita with this paper, with the extensions that he can make. He's done a great job, and for sure he can make it even better. And thanks everybody else for attending. So we'll see you next week.
Thank you very much.